A serious argument could be made that AM2R is among the most significant fan games of all time. Dr. M64's remake of Metroid 2 is noteworthy not only for its status as a faithful, high-quality remake, but also because the game was developed largely by a one-man team for nearly a full decade. AM2R stands as proof that, on very rare occasions, unyielding passion and determination can actually be enough to push a project over the finish line. Everything that could be said about AM2R has more or less been covered at this point. The story of AM2R's development, its subsequent DMCA by Nintendo, and its legacy are all extremely well documented online nowadays. In the end, it's a must-play for any Metroid fan and an incredible achievement for fan games in general. Not just because it was one of many independent attempts to sate demand for a Metroid 2 remake throughout the 2000s, but because it was the only such attempt to ever be completed. It's common knowledge that AM2R's full title, Another Metroid 2 Remake, was originally intended as a satirical reference to its status as one of many such remakes. The release of Metroid Zero Mission in 2004 had left fans hopeful that Nintendo would remake Metroid 2 with the same level of care, though little did anyone realize Nintendo wouldn't even consider remaking Metroid 2 themselves until well over a decade later. Fans did try to fill the gap left by Nintendo by creating Metroid 2 remakes of their very own, leading to efforts such as Metroid 2 Remixed, MTR, and Metroid Extinction. Unfortunately, these attempts to recreate Samus' journey into SR388 were ultimately ill-fated, becoming little more than a footnote in AM2R's success story, save for one very special exception. In April 2008, the trailer for Metroid SR388 was released. Primarily developed by a user known as Richter, the trailer was only around 2 minutes long, but was nonetheless extremely promising for a fan game at the time. The production values were unheard of for an independent team at the time, with a level of polish closer to that of an official product than anything resembling the jank typically seen in mid-2000s fan games. The trailer proudly showcased an impressive array of new features, such as improved animations, new areas and bosses, new abilities, and even a few unlockable goodies. Though Metroid SR388 was far from the first attempt at a fan remake of Metroid 2, it was easily one of the most prolific, right alongside AM2R itself. Of course, you already know how the story ends. The only Metroid 2 fan remake ever completed was AM2R. There was never a public demo of Metroid SR388, let alone a finished game. It's easy to write off Metroid SR388 as yet another footnote in AM2R's history, but the truth is, the story runs much deeper than that. Having reached out to Metroid SR388's core developers to learn more about the project, it's become clear that the full story behind the fan game's development is one of overambition, mismanagement, and irreconcilable creative differences. Though the project now lives in the shadow of its more successful peer, Metroid SR388 went on to develop a small legacy of its own, the influence of which can still be found even today. So what was Metroid SR388 then? Why did it fail years ago, and what did it leave behind that's worth remembering now? What made it so unique that it alone still has a cult following, while its contemporaries were largely forgotten? While Metroid SR388 is best known nowadays for its cinematic trailer and then high production values, its beginnings were much more humble and unassuming. Before it came to be known as Metroid SR388, it was an entirely unrelated project, simply known as Metroid Engine. As the name implies, it was a completely custom-made engine that its creator, Richter, had been tinkering with in the mid-2000s. Based on the title screen shown in the Metroid SR388 trailer, it seems that 2005 was when work on Metroid Engine began in earnest, though the engine was a purely private project for most of its life. It wasn't until 2007 that Richter made a dedicated Metroid Engine YouTube channel, sharing public videos of the engine's development online. While Von's work wasn't exactly making waves online just yet, enough footage was shared to get a feel for the engine's various features. Metroid Engine was built using Super Metroid's gameplay as the base, even down to including some of its unintended mechanics as properly built-in features. The project wasn't a simple one-to-one copy of Super Metroid either, between visible physics differences and new features, like a hot swap for Samus' arsenal of weapons and a new block-pushing mechanic. A number of the channel's videos also suggest that Richter probably wasn't treating his work on Metroid Engine too seriously. Ultimately, these videos were just pretty basic demonstrations of someone's custom game engine. Though Von Richter's branding was plastered all over the videos, not a single mention of SR388 was anywhere to be seen yet. The bulk of development on Metroid SR388 up to late 2007 seemed to be centered on just getting the physics and functionality of an unrelated custom engine working as intended. Towards late 2007, Von Richter seemingly started reworking Metroid Engine into something bigger, as the channel's uploads began alluding to enemies or features specific to Metroid 2. By the start of 2008, the Metroid Engine channel had ceased all activity. For the next few months, Von Richter stepped away from the public stage of Metroid fan games, and when Von Richter came back in April of the following year, he was about to change the game. Nowadays, SR388's reveal trailer may not seem that special, but for 2008, it was incredibly professional for an independent fan project. Rather than merely showcase some dry footage of a Metroid 2 remake in Super Metroid style, the trailer was instead expertly edited to spotlight everything new in the remake. Not only did the trailer showcase new environments and the promise of features beyond anything seen in an official 2D Metroid game yet, but it was all underscored by a grandiose remix of the surface theme from Metroid 2. Were it not for this trailer having the cinematic edge it did, Metroid SR388 probably wouldn't have commanded such a cult following to begin with. Following Metroid SR388's formal reveal, Von Richter got to work promoting the game around the internet. Subsequent updates for SR388 were uploaded to game trailers and YouTube, which were then promoted on Von Richter's Destructoid blog, Dig, and the Metroid 2002 forums, one of the more active Metroid communities of the time. While Von posted regular updates in the game's official thread on Metroid 2002, it wasn't long before Metroid SR388 got a website and messaging boards of its very own. According to the game's official website, Metroid SR388 was pitched as a fan game by fans for fans. SR388 wasn't merely hyped up as Metroid 2 in Super Metroid style, promising new upgrades and moves, new enemies and bosses, as well as unique gameplay elements. Samus was planned to have a bevy of new upgrades, with multiple missile and bomb types, new offensive skills, as well as suit upgrades based on Kraid and Ridley. Well, how most of these new features would have actually worked in-game is unknown, since development never got far enough for them to be implemented. What's clear is that they were promising some extremely big stuff for a Metroid fan game, something well beyond the average fan effort of the time. The website also shows that Metroid SR388 wasn't exactly a solo effort, as the game had a full development team on board. While several different people were working on the game's presentation, Von Richter took charge of the project's lead design as its sole programmer, level designer, and composer. By mid-2008, the team had reportedly replaced all of the original placeholder sprites from Super Metroid with their own original work. From the outside looking in, things seemed to be going pretty well for Von and the team throughout 2008. A few other teasers were shared, more talent was being brought on board, and Von actively kept up with fan discussion on Metroid 2002, including the promise of a demo later on in the year. Unfortunately, these few months after Metroid SR388's reveal would end up being the most prolific years of its life. Despite constant assurance, the SR388 demo ended up missing its target date of November 1st, leading Von to assure fans it was still in the works, after which he completely disappeared, leading to radio silence for 2 months. One of the game's developers, Infinity's End, later took to the SR388 IRC channel to break the ongoing silence. He speculated that Von had been prioritizing his financial stability and was concerned about Metroid SR388 being tied to a username he'd been using in all his time online, something that could impact his future career in music. Von himself would reappear and more or less corroborate these claims, citing personal issues as the reasoning for the delays and confirming that he would be using a pseudonym for the remainder of the game's development. Though he never publicly stated as such, the developers I spoke with attributed Von's name change to his concern that Nintendo would discover and kill the fan game while his name was attached to it. It's actually kind of funny to look back on, knowing the fate that would eventually befall AM2R after its release. Additionally, Von claimed that were SR388 to end as currently envisioned for any reason, there were still excellent contingency plans for the materials, code, and editor utilities if the worst came to pass. Though activity picked up again with Vaughn resuming work as project leader guy, he stepped down as a lead coder soon after, explaining that his music career was cutting into his free time. This ended up being Von Richter's final post about Metroid SR388. Not only had the SR388 website been down for a while now, but the original teasers were suddenly wiped from the official YouTube channel. Infinity's End returned a few months later to inform everyone that, at some point, the game's official forums had been hacked. In light of this, the game's development, which was not going that smoothly, was being taken private. And then, that was it. Metroid SR388's time in the spotlight was over. After August 2009, there were no further updates about Metroid SR388, though that's not to say the story ends here. The truth is, Metroid SR388's development was plagued with hurdles that were just too great to overcome. One of the biggest issues stems from the game's trailer. The very thing that put the game on the map to begin with being nothing more than smoke and mirrors. As Vaughn would later reveal to the team, the footage seen in the trailer wasn't taken from a semi-finished build of the game. It was from several unrelated prototype builds, carefully edited together to give viewers the impression the footage was all from a single product. The trailer itself was essentially just a mock-up, misrepresentative of how much work had been done up to that point. Now, the practice of using unfinished or tailor-made content in game trailers isn't uncommon among developers. I mean, even Game Maker's Toolkit recently admitted to doing it for his own upcoming game. There's nothing wrong with Metroid SR388's trailer essentially being a mock-up. The issue is that it was misrepresentative of how much work had been done up to that point. By all accounts, Metroid SR388 and the ideas behind it were very real. The team regularly discussed ideas and plans for every aspect of the game, even accounting for players trying to do low percent runs. In spite of the team's thorough plans for the game's map design, set pieces, and upgrade implementation, there was simply never a build of Metroid SR388 that actually resembled the game people had been anticipating. Speaking with Infinity's End, one of the game's developers, he recounts,
Vaughn created those trailers before he even finished the custom level editor that he eventually made. But even then, that level editor was in an unfinished state. The level design wasn't even remotely done. None of it was, not a single level. How do I know? I asked him, and he couldn't provide. The demos that he provided me was all I knew of the game's existence. Literally no part of the game ever existed. No levels, no puzzles, just Samus physics demos. I'm also pretty sure the dude never created a legitimate game design doc for the game either.
Meanwhile, Betatronic, one of the artists who worked on SR388, reflected on Vaughn's work in a slightly different light, stating,
Vaughn had a broad, inspired vision, but not the practical skills to make it work. Vaughn didn't really have the ability to create a complete game, much like he didn't lead the project with a firm hand. Between all the chaos of unfocused leadership and a project lead who was seemingly falling apart at the seams mentally, things kind of faded off. His love was for the process of things, and I think his general hope was that if he brought together enough talent, that things might start to align themselves.
To me, these accounts of Von Richter paint a picture of an exceptionally talented creator. Though his heart belonged to music, he clearly had an eye for style, was a capable sprite artist in his own right, and was obviously a skilled programmer. He spoke with great enthusiasm about the various scenarios, set pieces, and ideas he envisioned. The issue seemed to be that he just couldn't connect those dots into a finished picture. And it wasn't from a lack of effort. There were attempts to steer the project into a sort of phase 2 of development, around when Vaughn started calling himself Project Leader Guy. The game was ported over into Game Maker, more members were brought on board, and the custom level editor was finally finished, but the momentum was gone. Von Richter was steadily growing more reclusive, burnt out, and distant from the project. The SR388 website getting hacked was said to be an especially big blow to him, as it meant any information saved on the site's developer-only forums was lost, further setting the project back. Between the various setbacks, his own personal issues, and not having enough time or resources to dedicate to the project, Vaughn ultimately backed out and left the Metroid community altogether. Though it was true that there were contingency plans if the game was to fail, his departure meant that all of Metroid SR388's original assets were taken with him. There just wasn't a real path forward with the project in its current state. Metroid SR388 was well and truly finished, at least under Vaughn's leadership. In the end, Von Richter's departure wasn't enough to kill Metroid SR388 for good. When Von Richter had stepped down as SR388's lead coder, Betatronic decided to reach out to a friend of his, Tokensome, a skilled programmer and designer in his own right. There was hope that with Tokensome's help, what remained of the development team could find a way to soldier on and finish the game without Von Richter. Though initially reluctant, Tokensome was brought on board, gaining access to any of the project's remaining assets. Of course, the gesture amounted to very little at the time, as Metroid SR388 effectively died once Von Richter stepped away. While much of the original development team went their separate ways afterwards, a few members still kept in touch after the project's end. Every now and then, they'd reminisce and mull over the Metroid 2 remake that could have been, and these talks were ultimately the spark that set things in motion again. Some years after Von had left the project, Tokensome found himself suddenly struck with inspiration. For reasons even he's still not clear on to this day, he decided to start work on recreating the Metroid SR388 engine and Construct 2. A bit later down the line, he recruited the help of Infinity's End and Betatronic, both of whom had grown more involved with Metroid SR388's planning and direction towards the end. Out of everyone from the original development team, these three seemed to be the ones most determined to make Von Richter's original vision a reality. By the end of 2012, Tokensome, Betatronic, and Infinity's End all banded together in secret to try recreating Metroid SR388 themselves, and this time with a plan to avoid the pitfalls of the original project. With each team member having equal input on the game's direction, their initial focus was to recreate the mechanics and features seen in the original SR388 teasers. With Tokensome's new Metroid engine eventually surpassing Von Richter's work on the original, the team got to work on settling on a more firm direction for the remake. As Tokensome summarized,
Metroid SR388 was very much a retcon of Metroid 2, with a ton of original ideas, new areas, new abilities and weapons, new creatures, additional story elements, and an incredibly high standard of quality. We worked very hard to give it a unique identity, and it's unfortunate that it never got to see the light of day.
Elaborating more on the game's direction, Betatronic further explained,
We wanted something on Super Metroid's scale. Super Metroid isn't often called a remake, but in reality it is just Metroid 1, re-envisioned for the SNES. So we saw a version of Metroid 2 on the same level. In my perfect world, the focus would be on creating a compellingly dark and detailed version of SR388's caverns, but bring out more of the environmental storytelling. Every item you find would be a piece of the ancient puzzle that once resided in that place, and expanded zones would bring out future items like the gravity suit, since it only felt proper that it not appear in places it didn't before.
This new iteration of Metroid SR388 aimed to follow Von's original vision for the project as closely as possible, building off his original ideas and connecting them together in a way that felt more suitable for Metroid. The team's goal wasn't to create a one-to-one remake of Metroid 2. They planned on reinterpreting and expanding on Samus's journey into SR388 entirely. Metroid SR388 was still planned to center around exterminating all Metroids on planet SR388, but the team seemed to think it made little sense how Metroid 2's original progression was arbitrarily tied to how many Metroids were alive at a given moment. Back when Von Richter was still in charge of the game, the team had an idea to instead tie game progression to artifacts known as Chozo sigils, key items that let Samus lower the lava levels throughout the planet, leading to an early confrontation against the Queen Metroid. The team further built upon this progression system with additional key moments, such as a duel against the ghosts of two Chozo warriors for the right to earn the final Chozo sigil. These changes were just one part of how the new team, Betatronic in particular, had been reimagining Planet SR388. Whereas AM2R's version of Planet SR388 was rife with machinery and modernization, Metroid SR388's new direction was quite the opposite. Rather than exploring the various mechanical constructs left behind by the Chozo, Metroid SR388's focus was to have the player explore and discover the sordid secrets of an ancient, lost Chozo civilization. Where most players might have seen Planet SR388 as little more than a mess of stone caverns and winding tunnels, the team instead saw potential in exploring a darker side of the Chozo's culture. As the new team's version of Metroid SR388 continued development, more of the game was refined in line with this focused vision. Any excess, irrelevant, or redundant features were gradually pared back, especially in regards to Samus's planned upgrades, which saw items like the Kraid and Ridley suits being retooled into two halves of the more thematically appropriate Relica armor. All the while, Token's engine and the sprite work by Betatronic and Infinity's End continued improving far beyond what was seen in Von's version of the game. At one point, the team even managed to contact Von Richter again, though he was so divorced from the project by this point that he had little to contribute. Their attempts to coerce him into sharing the original assets or engines for further reference proved fruitless, as Von claimed that many of the original assets had been long lost to time by now. In the end, he offered little more than some additional input and praise to the team's work thus far. While they were no stronger for his involvement, it seemed like they at least had his blessing to continue picking up where he left off. Though the future seemed bright for Metroid SR388's second outing, history was set to repeat itself, and perhaps worse than before. As work continued on the Metroid SR388 revival, the team had an idea. What if the game started with a short prologue to set the tone, in which players controlled an ill-fated Galactic Federation trooper on planet SR388? Though everyone initially saw promise in the idea, one side of the team ultimately felt it wasn't worth spending development resources on, something the other side firmly disagreed with. Though it seemed to be nothing more than a simple disagreement at first, it proved to be the wedge that split the team in twain, as the disagreeing side moved ahead with work on the intro sequence regardless. From then on, the rift between the team only continued to grow. One side felt they should simply stay focused as they had been, while the other felt they needed a dedicated leader who could guide the game past the finish line. After all, the three of them probably couldn't finish the game by themselves. They would need to recruit additional help at some point, wouldn't they? Sooner or later, development would inevitably have to start ramping up. Eventually, they would have to move on from engine tests and into actual game design. In theory, the rationale seemed pretty sound. In practice, it only created problems. As more outside talent was brought in to help with SR388 sprites and music, the development suffered for it. The once focused direction of the game started being split in wildly different directions, with a new talent unsure of who to even listen to. The ever-increasing mismanagement also came at the expense of not only the game's visual identity, but the game itself, as attempts to take control of the game's direction led to its code being meddled with by people who didn't understand it. As Tokensum explains,
I would occasionally open the project to find new or changed content that we hadn't fully discussed, and new bugs to go along with it. The worst instance was an event that led to all of our map and room data being corrupted, and no one had an explanation. This was before we knew anything about source control, and while I kept regular backups of the game code, this data was an exception. As a result, the only remaining version of Metroid SR388 has just a few basic rooms, with very little content to even test out.
By late 2013, not even a full year into Metroid SR388's revival, its development had already been derailed. Attempts to push the game back on track were actively being undermined by those who thought they knew better. Though it's important to stress that there wasn't any ill intent in these circumstances. When you get down to it, the team all shared the same goal of finishing what Von Richter started. It was their love for the series and the promise of Metroid SR388 that drove them this far to begin with. At the end of the day, the issues they faced were simply down to creative differences, ones too great to work past. On top of the game's development constantly being set back, the second attempt at Metroid SR388 ultimately encountered the same issues as the first. The core development team was still fairly young and inexperienced, working on an overambitious project of this caliber. Not to mention, it was all being done in their spare time, with a budget of $0. Realizing there was no salvaging the mess the project had become, the core development team split off from the game, leaving Metroid SR388 behind before it even had a chance to truly come into its own. While this officially marks the end of Metroid SR388's development, this was only the beginning of the game's legacy. For as turbulent as the development became, this entire attempt to revive Metroid SR388 had never been formally announced to the public. The only ones who knew were those involved. But even that was about to change. At some point, a number of assets related to the Metroid SR388 revival somehow managed to leak out. While the leak didn't have that much compared to the team's finished work, it did include SR388's final test build. It's still unclear when exactly the leak took place or who was even responsible for it, but ironically, the leak might have actually helped preserve Metroid SR388's legacy in the long run. Elsewhere in the Metroid community of the time was a user who went by many names, but for these events he was mostly known as Physics, a proficient coder and spriter who'd been tinkering with Metroid engines of his own. According to those more familiar with him, he seemed to be fixated on the idea of recapturing the magic of Von Richter's original Metroid SR388 himself. Though work on his own Metroid engine began with hand-drawn assets, heavily based on any existing SR388 footage, the aforementioned leak eventually gave him some semblance of the real thing to start building off of. In October 2015, Physics took to the Cave Story tribute forums to showcase his work so far. Though he knew well enough when it came to coding a functional game engine and animating sprites, he was clueless about Metroid's actual game design. In need of some direction, he asked the user base for tips and insight into the design philosophy that gives the Metroid series its unique identity. Not even a few months later, Physics started posting on the AM2R and Metroid construction forums as well, sharing work-in-progress footage of his own Metroid engine, which was known simply as MEngine. While I'm sure this all sounds weirdly reminiscent of when Von Richter first started sharing his work online, there is one key difference between them. While Von Richter never released public demos of his work for others to download and play, Physics did. To the untrained eye, it'd be pretty easy to mistake MEngine for a continuation of Metroid SR388 in some way. While MEngine retained the high-quality sprite work and animation seen in SR388, its gameplay was more of a hybrid between Super Metroid and Zero Mission, as well as some ideas clearly derived from Von's various Metroid engine videos. While the demos only had a single testing room to mess around in, people were clearly impressed with the level of quality on display. For something still so early in development, the engine showed a lot of promise, especially as Physics continued refining the engine's gameplay and visuals. But remember, MEngine's similarities to Metroid SR388 were owed to more than mere inspiration. After a certain point, Physics had begun outright taking sprites that had leaked from the SR388 revival and was working them into his own engine. While there's evidence that Physics did put in the work to build off the original assets, redrawing or reanimating sprites as needed, he was still using a number of unedited sprites and tile sets that were never officially released to the public. Physics' work ended up drawing the SR388 development team out onto the Metroid construction forums, with Infinity's End being the first one to bring attention to MEngine's derivative nature, as well as Physics' past history of trying to get the original SR388 assets. However, he was mostly brushed off by the forum goers, since Physics' work at the time was just derivative of Metroid SR388, and technically didn't repurpose the work of others yet. It wasn't until the engine started using Metroid SR388's actual assets that Betatronic and Tokensome got involved, as they were outraged to learn that their work was somehow stolen and now being used without their approval. They were actually fine with MEngine being derivative of SR388, but they drew the line at outright theft. The two were far more persistent than Infinity's End, as they asked Physics to remove the stolen assets on several occasions. Once it was proven that he wasn't budging, though, they escalated the issue into its own dedicated thread. To say there was friction between the two sides would be putting it mildly, but it's hard not to see the reasoning for both of their stances. Despite the chaotic development, Metroid SR388 still meant a lot to Beta and Token. A great deal of planning and work had been done that almost nobody else knew of. Not only did they still have plans for all of those unused concepts, but the leaked assets were still one part of that collaborative effort. It would be disrespectful to the rest of the Metroid SR388 team if that work was unceremoniously handed out online, with no guarantee it'd even be put to good use. Physics, on the other hand, had his own vision and lofty standards to reach. Not only did he feel it was necessary to use those sprites as a springboard for his own work, but he also believed that what he saw the team's work on Metroid SR388 was too high quality to be left forgotten on aging hard drives. Which is why, against the wishes of the original development team, he'd later upload the stolen assets online for others to use. Though he eventually and begrudgingly complied, slowly removing and replacing the stolen assets with his own original sprite work, MEngine's constant use of stolen work was found to be in violation of Metroid Construction's rules. As a result, Physics was permanently banned from the website in July 2016, effectively killing MEngine's online presence in just under a year. And coincidentally, only about 1 week away from when AM2R was finally released to the public. Physics would later upload one last MEngine gameplay video to YouTube, describing MEngine as a pipe dream, and more or less confirming he's moved on from it. Though not before handing out the engine's source code when asked in a YouTube comment. Griping about his experience and lack of resources, he advised that nobody try to build off his engine, describing the code as far too esoteric and the standards set too high. He then claimed that no ragtag team would ever look at my source code, figure it all out, hatch it, and build off of it with a game plan ready. Though his words were meant to be a warning, they somehow ended up becoming a prophecy. In the middle of all this was HackMe, a young developer who'd been closely following both Metroid SR388 and MEngine, and he decided he was gonna use Physics' work to create a Metroid fan game of his own. Physics even claimed at one point that all main functions of the engine were complete. All it needed was an actual game built around it. Though according to the small team HackMe put together for the project, there was also truth that Physics' code really was difficult to parse and work with. Regardless, they pressed on with their goal of releasing a small-scale fan game, and after a few years of work, the end result was Metroid Origins, released in 2018. It's an alternate universe version of Metroid 2 that runs in MEngine, depicting an extremely truncated version of Samus' adventure on planet SR388. In a very roundabout sense, Von Richter's work on Metroid SR388 lives on through Metroid Origins, being heavily descended from his original work in some form. Though this was never HackMe's intention, as Metroid Origins was never meant to be a replacement for Metroid SR388. It's a pretty short tech demo styled game that shouldn't take more than a few hours to run through. Personally, I think it's a great showcase for what MEngine is capable of. The game looks and feels great, though it's too short to serve as a proper Metroid experience. It just doesn't have the runtime to build up the isolated atmosphere or the deep, interconnected map design that Metroid is typically associated with. While I think Metroid Origins is pretty cool for what it is, it's also a little bittersweet. In a way, Metroid Origins is the closest we'll probably ever get to the release of Metroid SR388, and the two aren't really equivalent. Sure, Metroid SR388 has probably always been distinguished by its extremely high production values, but it was always meant to be seen as far more than the Metroid fan game with smooth animations. It's easy to see why people would dismiss the game as such, given that Von's original trailers were all that the public had ever seen of it to begin with. But behind the curtain, literal years of planning had been spent on Metroid SR388's story, atmosphere, gameplay, and world design. There were several people who played a part in what was intended to be an ambitious fan remake of one of the Metroid series' most important entries. While there isn't a finished game to show for their work, there are still gigabytes of sprites, concept art, and even game design documents left over, all serving as proof of the Metroid 2 remake that could have been. Even if the entirety of Metroid SR388's assets and documents were released today, I doubt anyone would be able to finish the game themselves. The only ones who truly understood the heart and soul of Metroid SR388 were those closest to the game's original development, and even they couldn't see it through to the end. And so, the release of Metroid Origins effectively marks the end of Metroid SR388's long, complicated history. What started with a man casually putting a Metroid engine together in his free time ended up taking on a life of its own, inspiring and capturing the imagination of Metroid fans for years to come. While Von's original vision never came to be, his work ended up inspiring the likes of Infinity's End, Betatronic, Tokensum, Physics, HackMe, as well as dozens of other Metroid fans, all in ways that he probably never imagined when he first started working on Metroid Engine almost 2 decades ago. And honestly, it's not hard to see why. Von Richter's work on Metroid SR388 was extremely ahead of its time. The scope, production values, and technical work were all a cut above its contemporaries. In essence, Metroid SR388 was in the same league as fan games like Chrono Resurrection, promising an experience beyond anything else of the time. Though Von may not have had the skill to make that experience a reality, he definitely knew how to sell people on his vision. It's a testament to Metroid SR388's potential that so many people tried to keep the flag flying long after Von Richter disappeared. It all begs the question, if Metroid SR388 was somehow completed, would it have been as good a remake as AM2R? It's possible, but it's hard to say for sure. Where AM2R sought to modernize Metroid 2 in a style closer to Zero Mission's fast-paced gameplay, SR388 was envisioned as a slower, more atmospheric experience closer to the stylings of Super Metroid. There'd no doubt be discussions over which game is the definitive remake of Metroid 2, as you still see with AM2R and Samus Returns today, but I get the feeling more people would have been open to accepting SR388 and AM2R as their own distinct experiences that could coexist together. Of course, that's purely speculation. The fact AM2R is the only finished fan remake of Metroid 2 should say a lot by itself. In the end, Von Richter's original promise of an expansive Super Metroid-style remake of Metroid 2 was a hollow one. It was never meant to be, at least not in his hands. Nearly 2 decades have passed since work first began on Metroid SR388. AM2R continues to enjoy active fan support to this day, while Nintendo later released their very own remake of Metroid 2. Since then, they've released the mythical Metroid Dread and an incredible remaster of Metroid Prime 1, with Metroid Prime 4 still looming somewhere on the horizon. Right now, the Metroid series is enjoying a period of success it hasn't seen since the mid-2000s. The need for a Metroid 2 remake, let alone a new Metroid game, has been sated for a few years now. In the time since then, much of Metroid SR388's development team have moved on with their lives. Von Richter hasn't been seen online in well over a decade, leaving the Metroid series behind to pursue his love of music. What exactly he's up to nowadays, nobody really knows. Meanwhile, Infinity's End has continued supporting the series through his work as the webmaster of Metroid Database, which remains one of the biggest Metroid fan sites to this day. As for Betatronic and Tokensum, the two have banded together with Kimo, another member of the attempted SR388 revival, to form Mawilo Studio. The team's been pretty busy in the years since, working on creating their own original IP, the first entry of which is the upcoming Elysium Stardiver. Though the game seems to be its own thing, Token and Beta have both made it clear that the soul of Metroid SR388 lives on in Elysium, with SR388's overall design philosophy, world building, and other original ideas being worked into the game wherever possible. Even after the original development team moved on from Metroid SR388, it seems like the game hasn't entirely left them after all these years. Though it's currently unclear how much of the fan game will shine through in Elysium, it goes to show that even if Metroid SR388 is no more, its spirit hasn't burned out just yet. Whether it's in another game or another galaxy, the work started by Von Richter so long ago still continues to live on and inspire others, even to this day.